The first time I understood that my family did not see me as a person happened on an ordinary Tuesday in the middle of a phone call I almost ignored. It was early March 2020, and I was sitting in my car outside my apartment in a quiet suburb near Portland, Oregon. Rain streaked down the windshield in thin, impatient lines. I had just finished a long shift at the logistics firm where I worked as a contracts coordinator. Nothing glamorous. Just purchase orders, compliance reviews, and the kind of details that keep companies from bleeding money quietly. My name is Evelyn Hart. I was 31 years old then. Old enough to have built a life on my own terms. Young enough to still believe my parents cared about how that life felt. The call came from my mother. I remember hesitating before answering, my finger hovering over the screen. Something in my chest tightened. Not fear exactly, more like anticipation trained by years of experience. I answered anyway. She did not ask how I was. She did not mention the weather or my drive home or anything that would signal concern. She went straight to the point. "Your brother needs help," she said. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the seat. Of course he did. My younger brother Nathan had always needed help. Financial help, emotional help, legal help. Someone to explain his mistakes away so they did not have to count. What kind of help, I asked? She exhaled sharply, already irritated. "He's in a tight spot. The business loan is falling through, and your father and I think you should step in." I stared at the gray sky through the windshield. Step in how? There was a pause, the kind that meant the answer had already been decided. "You have savings," she said. "You don't have children. You've always been responsible." That word, responsible. In my family it meant available. How much, I asked. She named a number that made my stomach go cold. Money I had spent years setting aside. Money meant for a down payment for stability for a future I had built quietly without their help. "I can't," I said, my voice calm, even as something inside me braced. "That money is tied up. I have plans." Her tone shifted instantly. "So does your brother," she snapped. "And his plans affect this family." There it was. The line I had heard in different forms my entire life. Family comes first. What she never said was who in the family counted. I told her again that I could not do it. I explained briefly without emotion. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I thought clarity would be enough. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said something that settled into my bones in a way I did not expect. "You've always been selfish," she said. "You just hide it better than most." The words landed cleanly without drama. I felt something detach inside me, not pain, recognition. "I'll think about it," I said, because ending the call felt easier than continuing it. When I hung up, I sat there for a long time listening to the rain hit the roof of my car. I did not cry. I did not rage. I replayed the conversation slowly, the way you do when you are checking a lock you thought was secure. This was not new. It was simply clearer. Growing up, I had been the quiet one, the easy one, the child who did well in school, stayed out of trouble, never asked for much. My parents liked to say they never worried about me. What they meant was that I never disrupted their expectations. Nathan, on the other hand, was a project, a risk, a promise they refused to let fail. Every mistake he made was framed as potential. Every boundary crossed was brushed off as learning. And every time he needed something, the solution came with my name attached to it. I had paid for his textbooks, covered his rent once, co-signed a lease I pretended not to regret. Each time my parents assured me it was temporary. Each time they promised it would even out. It never did. That night, I went upstairs to my apartment and made dinner out of habit. Pasta, sauce from a jar. I ate standing at the counter, barely tasting it, my mind drifting back through memories I had carefully minimized over the years. The birthdays where my gifts were practical and his were celebrated. The holidays where my plans were adjusted to accommodate his needs. The conversations where my successes were acknowledged briefly, then redirected toward what Nathan was struggling with now. I had mistaken predictability for love. 2 days later, my father called. His tone was measured, authoritative, the voice he used when he wanted compliance without discussion. "Your mother tells me you're being difficult," he said. "I'm being honest," I replied. He sighed like a man burdened by my inadequacy. "This isn't about you. This is about the family." "I am part of the family," I said. Another pause. Not in the same way he said without realizing what he had admitted. I did not respond. There was nothing to say that would change that truth. When we hung up, I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. I looked at the numbers on the screen, the quiet proof of years of discipline and restraint. I realized how fragile my independence really was if the people closest to me felt entitled to it. That was the moment the story shifted, not because something terrible happened, but because something small finally broke the illusion I had been protecting for years. I did not know yet how far they would go when I refused. I did not know how quickly love would turn into pressure, then accusation, then something darker. All I knew was this. For the first time, I was no longer willing to disappear to keep the peace. And once that decision is made, even silently, everything else begins to rearrange itself around it. After that call, nothing exploded right away. That was the part that fooled me, the calm before pressure learns a new shape. The next few weeks passed with an uneasy quiet. My parents did not call again. Nathan did not text. No one demanded an answer. On the surface, it looked like they had accepted my refusal. I should have known better. Silence in my family was never peace, it was strategy. I went back to my routines. Work during the day, groceries on the way home, evenings spent scrolling mindlessly or reading until my eyes blurred. From the outside, my life looked stable. From the inside, I felt like I was standing on a floor that had started to creak. The first sign came in the form of a forwarded email. It arrived from my mother on a Thursday afternoon, sent to my personal inbox while I was reviewing a supplier contract at work. The subject line read simply, "Something to consider." Inside was a message from a local bank officer I vaguely recognized from church years ago. Polite, professional. He wrote about family discussions and potential options for restructuring personal assets to support a small business venture. My name was mentioned as a possible guarantor. My hands went cold on the keyboard. I did not reply. I forwarded the email to myself and archived it. Then I finished my workday like nothing had happened. That night, my mother called again. This time, her voice was softer. Careful, the tone she used when she wanted something but did not want to provoke resistance. "We're just exploring options," she said. "No one is forcing you." "I didn't agree to be discussed," I replied. She laughed lightly as if I were being dramatic. "Oh, Evelyn, it was just a conversation." "About my finances," I said. There was a brief silence, then a sigh. "You're being very sensitive lately." There it was again, the gentle invalidation, the suggestion that my discomfort was the real problem. I ended the call shortly after claiming exhaustion. Over the next few days, the pressure became more coordinated. An aunt texted asking if everything was okay, mentioning how stressed my parents were. A cousin commented on one of my social media posts about family needing to stick together in hard times. A family friend sent a message reminding me how much my parents had sacrificed for us growing up. The message was clear. If I did not comply, I would be framed as the problem. I stopped responding. At work, I noticed myself becoming more alert. I double-checked emails before sending them. I saved documents I normally would have trusted systems to keep. I did not talk about my family at lunch anymore. Something in me had shifted into observation mode. The second escalation came on a Sunday evening. My parents showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door and found them standing in the hallway, coats on, expressions tight but controlled. My mother held a folder against her chest like a shield. My father did not wait for an invitation. "We need to talk," he said, already stepping inside. I let them in because saying no felt like it would create a scene, and scenes were always used against me later. They sat at my small dining table, the same one I had bought secondhand, and assembled myself. I stayed standing. My mother opened the folder and slid papers toward me. They were loan documents, drafts, not signed. My name typed neatly in several places. "This is just preliminary," she said quickly. "We wanted you to see what it would look like." I stared at the papers without touching them. "You discussed this without me," I said. My father leaned back in his chair. "You're overreacting. We assumed you'd want to help." "Assumed," I repeated. Nathan's name appeared again and again in the documents. His business, his debt, his projections. My role was simple: backstop, safety net, insurance. I felt strangely calm. "I'm not signing anything," I said. My mother's eyes filled instantly as if on cue. "How can you be so cold?" My father's voice hardened. "After everything we've done for you." I looked at him, really looked at him. "What have you done for me as an adult?" I asked quietly. "That didn't come with strings attached." His face flushed. "We raised you." "That was your job," I said. The room went very still. My mother stood abruptly. "You've changed," she said, her voice shaking with anger now. "Ever since you moved away, you've become selfish." No, I replied, I've become independent. They left soon after, slamming the door harder than necessary. I locked it behind them and leaned against the wall, my heart pounding for the first time that day. Not fear, adrenaline. Because I knew something then that I had been avoiding for years. They were not going to stop. They did not see my refusal as a boundary. They saw it as a challenge. The next morning, I checked my credit report out of instinct more than logic. There was an inquiry I did not recognize. It had been made the previous Friday. I stared at the screen, my mind already assembling the pattern. That was the moment the situation crossed from uncomfortable to dangerous. This was no longer about family tension or emotional manipulation. This was about control, access, and entitlement. And I understood with the clarity that did not require panic, that staying quiet would not protect me. It never had. The story I had told myself for years that being agreeable kept me safe collapsed in that instant. Because now I could see it clearly. My silence had not been love. It had been permission, and I was done giving it. The credit inquiry sat on my screen like a bruise I couldn't stop touching. I refreshed the page twice as if it might disappear if I looked again. It didn't. The date was real. The institution was real, and I had never authorized it. I did not call my parents. I did not text Nathan. I did not ask questions. I had learned finally that asking questions only gave them room to lie. Instead, I closed my laptop, put on my coat, and drove to work with my jaw set and my thoughts unusually quiet. This was not panic. Panic is loud. This was calculation. All morning, I did my job like muscle memory, reviewed clauses, flagged inconsistencies, sent emails with neutral language and precise phrasing. On the outside, nothing about me changed. On the inside, I was building a timeline. The inquiry had happened on Friday. My parents visited on Sunday. The loan documents were already prepared. My name was already typed in. They hadn't reacted to my refusal. They had anticipated it. That afternoon, I stepped into an empty conference room and called the credit bureau directly. I asked questions carefully. Dates, methods, contact information used. The representative was polite, unbothered, efficient. Yes, the inquiry was initiated by a local lender, she said. Information was provided verbally. By whom, I asked. She hesitated. I cannot disclose names, but the caller had correct identifying details. Full name, date of birth, prior address. My stomach stayed steady. That information did not belong to Nathan. It belonged to my parents. I thanked her and ended the call. When I sat back in my chair, I realized something unsettling. If this had happened a year earlier, I would have doubted myself. I would have assumed misunderstanding, overreaction, coincidence. But now, with the pattern laid out clearly, doubt felt unnecessary. This was not a mistake. It was a test. That evening, I didn't go straight home. I stopped at a small coffee shop near the office and sat alone in the corner, notebook open, pen moving steadily. I wrote everything down. Dates, conversations, names, exact phrases I could still hear in my mother's voice. Family sacrifices. You don't have children. You're being sensitive. We assumed you'd help. Each line looked different on paper. Less emotional, more procedural. I slept poorly that night, but not because I was afraid. My mind kept working through scenarios, rehearsing responses I would not give, conversations I would not have. By morning, I knew what I had to do next. I took a personal day and drove to a branch of my bank I had never visited before. I asked to speak with a manager. When I sat down across from him, I did not explain my feelings. I explained my facts. Unauthorized credit inquiry. Family members attempting access, potential misuse of personal information. His demeanor shifted immediately. We'll place a fraud alert, he said, and lock down third-party access. Permanent, I replied. He nodded. That's wise. When I left, I felt lighter, not relieved, grounded. Next, I scheduled a consultation with an attorney. Not a dramatic one. Not someone who advertised conflict. A quiet professional whose website talked about boundaries, documentation, and prevention. I sat in her office that afternoon and told my story from the beginning. Not emotionally, chronologically. She listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and said, "You're not imagining this." The validation was calm, not dramatic. That mattered. What you're describing is escalation, she continued. They're moving from emotional pressure to financial interference. What should I do? I asked. Stop talking, she said simply, and start protecting yourself. She outlined steps: credit freezes, written notices, documentation, and if necessary, a formal cease and desist. Do I need that now? I asked. She considered it. Not yet, but you're close. I left her office with a folder of instructions and the distinct sense that I had crossed a line I could not uncross. That evening, my mother called again. I watched the phone ring. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "We need to clear the air," she said. "Your behavior is creating unnecessary tension. Your father is very upset." I deleted it. Nathan texted next. "I need to talk. This is getting blown out of proportion." I did not reply. For the first time in my life, I let their discomfort sit where it belonged. The next escalation came faster than I expected. 2 days later, my supervisor asked if I had a moment. His tone was neutral, professional. We sat in his office with the door closed. "Everything okay outside of work?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. "I'm asking because we received an unusual call." My chest tightened just slightly. "From whom?" I asked. "A family member," he said carefully, "expressing concern about your stress level." There it was. I didn't react. "They didn't accuse you of anything," he added quickly. "But it was inappropriate." "I agree," I said. He studied my face. "Is there something we should know?" "Yes," I replied. "My family is attempting to involve themselves in matters they have no authority over. I'm handling it." He nodded. "Good. If it happens again, let us know immediately." When I left his office, something cold and solid settled in my chest. They had crossed another line, not just into my finances, into my reputation. That night, I forwarded the voicemail, the bank records, and the email logs to my attorney. Her response came within an hour. "Now we act." She drafted the letter, formal, specific, addressed to my parents and copied to Nathan. It outlined unauthorized financial activity, workplace interference, a clear directive to cease all contact related to my finances, employment, or personal information. No emotion, no blame, just boundaries and consequences. I read it twice, then approved it. The letter went out the next morning by certified mail and email. When it was done, I sat alone in my apartment, the quiet pressing in from all sides. I expected guilt. What I felt instead was clarity. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was responding to reality. And I understood something I had never allowed myself to say out loud before. This was no longer a family problem. It was a legal one. And that shift, more than anything else, terrified them. Because it meant I was no longer playing the role they had assigned me. I was stepping out of the story entirely. And they were about to find out what happens when the person holding everything together finally lets go. The cease and desist letter landed harder than I expected, not because of how it was written, but because of what it represented. It was the first time I had introduced something into our family dynamic that did not bend, negotiate, or apologize. And they felt it immediately. My mother called first, not my phone, my work phone. I stared at the screen when the receptionist transferred the call, my name blinking back at me like a warning. I let it ring twice before picking up my voice even. "This line is recorded," I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end, a sharp intake of breath. "Evelyn," she said, "how could you do this to us?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. "You sent a legal threat?" She continued, her voice shaking now. "To your own parents." "It wasn't a threat," I said. "It was a boundary." "You embarrassed us," she said. "Your father is furious. People are asking questions." "I'm not responsible for your image," I replied. Her tone hardened instantly. "You've always cared more about yourself than anyone else." I almost smiled at the predictability of it. "This conversation is over," I said. "Please don't call me again." I hung up and documented the call. Time, number, content. Within an hour, my attorney emailed me. They received the letter. They were upset. They wanted to talk. We declined. That night, Nathan showed up at my apartment. I knew it was him before I opened the door. The way he knocked, too familiar, too confident. I opened it just enough to see his face. "You've gone too far," he said, not bothering with hello. "Leave," I said. He stepped closer. "Mom's crying. Dad's talking about cutting you off." I met his eyes. "From what?" He scoffed. "You think you're untouchable now because you hired a lawyer." "No," I said. "I think you should leave." His jaw tightened. "You don't get it. This affects all of us." "It always has," I said, "just not equally." He stared at me for a moment, searching for the sister who used to soften, to bend, to explain. When he didn't find her, his expression shifted. "Fine," he said, "but don't be surprised when this comes back on you." I closed the door without responding and locked it. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of what they might do next, but because my body was finally processing something it had been holding for years. Grief, not the dramatic kind. The quiet realization that the people who raised me were willing to risk my stability to preserve Nathan's. That hurt in a way anger never had. The next morning, my credit monitoring service sent another alert. A second inquiry attempt blocked. This one had been made under Nathan's name. I forwarded the alert to my attorney. Her reply was short. They're panicking. By the end of the week, the pressure intensified. An aunt emailed asking why I was being so harsh. A family friend left a voicemail reminding me that parents don't live forever. My grandmother sent a handwritten note saying she didn't recognize me anymore. They were closing ranks. That was when I understood something important. This was not just about money. It was about hierarchy. I had stepped out of my assigned position and the system was trying to push me back into place. At work, the consequences arrived quietly. My supervisor asked me to stop by his office again. This time, a representative from HR was present. Their expressions were neutral, professional. "We want to be transparent," HR said. "We've received additional contact from someone claiming to be a close family member." I nodded. "My parents." "They expressed concern about your mental well-being," she continued. "We don't believe there's an issue, but we need to document that the contact is inappropriate." "I agree," I said. My supervisor leaned forward. "Are you safe?" "Yes," I replied, "but I am being harassed." The word felt heavy but accurate. HR nodded. "Then we'll take steps to block external communication, and we recommend you continue working through legal channels." When I left the office, my hands were steady. My parents had always framed themselves as protectors. Now, in official rooms with neutral observers, their behavior looked exactly like what it was: control. That weekend, I drove out of the city and sat by the river for hours. I watched the water move steadily forward, unbothered by obstacles in its path. I thought about the way my family had always described me: independent but distant, strong but cold, responsible but selfish. Every label served the same purpose: to justify taking from me without asking. And suddenly everything made sense. They didn't love my independence. They relied on it, because it meant I could carry weight without complaining. That night I made another decision. I updated my will, not because I was planning for death, but because I was planning for autonomy. I changed beneficiaries, removed family members, appointed a neutral executor. When I signed the document, my hand didn't shake. This was not revenge. It was insulation. 2 days later, my attorney called. "They want mediation," she said. "They're saying this has gone too far." "It has," I replied. "Just not in the way they mean." She paused. "There's something else." "What?" "Your parents have been speaking to Nathan's lender," she said. "They've suggested you were verbally committed to backing the loan and then backed out." My chest tightened. "That's false," I said. "I know," she replied, "but it's becoming part of a narrative." I closed my eyes slowly. They were rewriting reality, and that was dangerous. "We need to escalate," she continued. "If they continue misrepresenting your involvement, this moves into defamation." I didn't hesitate. "Do it," I said. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. I had not chosen this fight, but I was no longer avoiding it, because the truth was clear now. The moment I stopped being useful, I became disposable, and the only reason they were still reaching for me was because they hadn't yet accepted that I was gone. The next step would force them to. Not emotionally, legally. And once that door closed, it would not reopen. Not for apologies. Not for guilt. Not for blood. This was no longer about family. It was about survival. And I was done sacrificing myself to keep a system alive that had always fed on my silence. The defamation notice went out on a Monday morning, timed deliberately, not at the start of the week when emotions still run high, and not on a Friday when people tell themselves they can ignore problems until later. It landed mid-morning when reality has nowhere to hide. I did not read it again before it was sent. I had already approved every word. That afternoon, my phone stayed silent. No calls, no texts, no relatives checking in with concern wrapped in accusation. The absence felt unnatural at first, like the moment after a fire alarm stops, but before you're sure the building is safe. Then just after 6 in the evening, my father emailed. Not a voicemail, not a call, an email. That alone told me everything. His message was brief and restrained, stripped of the authority he usually leaned on. "We need to resolve this privately. You've misunderstood our intentions, and your actions are creating serious consequences." I forwarded it to my attorney without responding. Her reply came back quickly. "Do not engage." The next escalation came from an unexpected direction. The lender Nathan had been working with contacted me directly. A polite email, professional, neutral. He asked to confirm my involvement as a guarantor, citing previous conversations with my parents that suggested verbal agreement. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. This was no longer implication. This was a claim. I responded with a single sentence copied to my attorney. I have never agreed verbally or in writing to guarantee any loan associated with Nathan Hart or his business. I hit send. The reply came less than an hour later. Thank you for the clarification. We will update our records. I exhaled slowly, my body releasing tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. But the damage had already begun to surface. 2 days later, my supervisor asked to see me again. This time there was no HR, just him. The door closed gently behind me. I want you to hear this from me, he said. Your work is solid. Your reputation here is intact. I nodded, but he continued. When outside interference reaches this level, it triggers attention above my pay grade. I understood. What does that mean? I asked. It means they're watching, he said. Not you, the situation. I left his office with a strange mix of reassurance and resolve. My family had tried to drag my professional life into their mess, and in doing so, they had drawn scrutiny they could not control. That weekend, I received a certified letter. I recognized my parents' return address immediately. I did not open it. I handed it to my attorney on Monday. She read it, then looked up at me with an expression that was almost sympathetic. They're denying everything, she said, and accusing you of emotional instability. I nodded once. Of course they are. She leaned forward. This is where it gets serious. They're positioning you as unreliable to protect themselves. I didn't feel offended. I felt focused. What are our options? I asked. She outlined them calmly. Demand retraction, file formal complaints, escalate to civil action if the misrepresentation continued. I listened without interrupting. Proceed, I said when she finished. That night I went home and sat on my couch in the dark, the city humming outside my window. I thought about the word unstable. How often it gets used to discredit people who stop cooperating. How easily concern becomes a weapon when someone refuses to be controlled. I remembered the girl I used to be. The one who stayed quiet so no one would accuse her of being difficult. The one who absorbed discomfort so others could stay comfortable. That girl would have folded. She would have explained herself, apologized for the misunderstanding, offered something to smooth things over. I wasn't her anymore. The next week, the consequences began to land. Nathan's loan application was paused pending clarification. The lender requested additional documentation from him. His timeline collapsed. My parents panicked. They called my attorney, not me. They wanted a meeting. She declined on my behalf and reiterated the demand for retraction and cessation of all contact. That was when the narrative cracked. A family friend reached out privately asking if everything was okay. She had heard conflicting stories, something about money, something about pressure. I responded carefully. I said I was protecting my finances and my job, nothing more. Her reply was telling. I thought as much. Word travels faster than control ever does. The following Friday, my attorney called with an update that made me sit up straighter. There's a trust, she said. What kind of trust? I asked. A family trust. Established years ago. You're listed as a contingent beneficiary. I closed my eyes slowly. I had never been told about it. They assumed your compliance, she continued. Your father mentioned it casually in correspondence with Nathan's lender. As leverage. My throat tightened. So they used my future as bait, I said. Yes, she replied, without disclosure. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not anger, understanding. This wasn't about helping Nathan. It never had been. It was about keeping me in line. Can we access the documents? I asked. Yes, she said. And once we do, the dynamics change. That night I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, because I finally understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a system built on control, secrecy, and assumed obedience. And now, with documentation in hand and legal momentum on my side, I was no longer reacting. I was positioning. The next move would not be emotional. It would be decisive. And once it was made, there would be no going back. Because power once reclaimed does not ask permission to stay. The trust documents arrived in a plain envelope thicker than I expected, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with paper. I sat at my kitchen table and went through them slowly, page by page, my coffee untouched beside me. It had been created years earlier, shortly after my grandmother downsized her home. Assets moved quietly, language drafted carefully, control centralized. My parents were trustees. Nathan was named primary beneficiary. I was listed as contingent, only if certain conditions were met, conditions no one had ever explained to me. The wording was precise, almost elegant in its restraint. Distribution subject to discretion. support contingent upon cooperation with family interests, future allocations adjustable based on need. Need in this case clearly meant Nathan. I didn't feel shocked. That surprised me. Somewhere deep down, I had always known that whatever safety net existed in my family had holes cut specifically to fit me through. What struck me instead was how long they had assumed my silence. They never told me about the trust because they never thought they had to. They believed my loyalty was permanent, my compliance automatic, my future something they could reference casually, like a card they might play later if necessary. I forwarded everything to my attorney with a short note. So this is the leverage. Her response came back within the hour. Yes, and now it's evidence. We scheduled a call that evening. She walked me through the implications carefully, not rushing, not dramatizing. They used the idea of future security to justify present control, she said. Without disclosure, without consent. Can they do that, I asked? They did, she replied. Whether it holds up is another question. The more important point, she explained, was not what the trust promised, but how it had been used. As a narrative, as a threat, as an unspoken reminder that stepping out of line came with consequences. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. So even my independence was provisional, I said. Yes, she replied, in their minds. When the call ended, I sat in silence, letting the reality settle. I thought about every conversation where my parents had warned me not to rock the boat. Every time they had implied that being agreeable was in my own best interest. Every vague reference to family security, to what would happen someday. Someday had always been a leash. The next escalation didn't come from them. It came from Nathan. He emailed me late one night, not angry, not defensive, almost conciliatory. I didn't know about the trust the way they set it up, I swear. They said it was for all of us. This is blowing up my life too. I read the message twice, then once more. There it was. The familiar move. Distance himself just enough to preserve access. Express confusion without taking responsibility. Frame himself as collateral damage. I didn't reply. Instead, I wrote a timeline. Not just of recent events, but of years. Money transfers, favors, requests, patterns. I included amounts, dates, contexts. I attached emails I had saved out of instinct and habit. By the time I finished, it was clear even to me. This wasn't favoritism. It was extraction. 2 days later, my attorney requested a formal accounting of the trust, a detailed breakdown of distributions, adjustments, and discretionary decisions made by the trustees. The response from my parents' counsel was delayed, then defensive, then incomplete, which told us everything we needed to know. They had never expected anyone to ask. At work, things shifted subtly. I was pulled into a meeting with senior leadership, not an interrogation, an acknowledgement. We're aware of external pressure being applied, one of them said. We want you to know your position here is not contingent on your family's behavior. I thanked them, my voice steady. Walking back to my desk, I felt something new. Not relief, authority. My parents had always spoken as if they were the final arbiters of my security, as if everything I had built existed at their discretion. Now I could see how small that assumption really was. The following weekend, I drove back to my hometown for the first time since everything began. Not to see them, to meet with an independent financial advisor my attorney had recommended. Someone with no history, no loyalties, no emotional investment. We sat across from each other in a quiet office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. I laid out the facts. He listened, nodding occasionally, his expression neutral. Your financial independence is real, he said finally, but it's been undermined by perceived obligation. That perception wasn't accidental, I said. No, he agreed. It was cultivated. He helped me restructure accounts, move assets, establish safeguards that made third-party interference impossible. We set up contingencies that did not rely on goodwill or family approval. When I left his office, I felt taller. That night, my mother emailed again. We are heartbroken. You've taken this too far. This is not who we raised. I didn't respond. I was beginning to understand that the version of me they wanted had always been incomplete. They didn't raise me to be autonomous. They raised me to be reliable. There's a difference. The real turning point came a few days later when my attorney called with a tone I hadn't heard before. They're asking to settle, she said. Settle what I asked. The narrative, she replied. They want this to stop. They're willing to amend the trust, remove conditions, make distributions explicit. I closed my eyes, and I asked, and they want you to withdraw the defamation action and cease all further claims. There it was. The offer. Not an apology, not accountability. A transaction. I didn't answer right away. That evening, I went for a long walk through my neighborhood. The air was cool. Leaves crunched under my shoes. Houses glowed softly from the inside. I thought about what they were really offering. Money finally made visible. In exchange for silence. In exchange for compliance. In exchange for stepping back into a system that had always required my erasure. By the time I got home, the answer was clear. I called my attorney the next morning. No, I said. She didn't sound surprised. We proceed, she replied. When I hung up, I felt something settle into place. The trust had never been my safety net. It had been their control mechanism. And now that it was exposed, it had lost its power. Because I was no longer negotiating my dignity for future promises. I was choosing certainty. And certainty does not beg. It documents. It protects. And it moves forward whether anyone is ready for it or not. The refusal landed harder than any accusation I could have made. For days after my attorney delivered the answer, there was nothing. No emails, no messages, no relatives testing the waters with concern disguised as curiosity. The silence felt deliberate, like a room where everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first. I knew what that meant. They were regrouping. At work, my focus sharpened. Not because I was trying to escape what was happening, but because clarity has a way of reorganizing your attention. I noticed details I might have overlooked before. Language in contracts that carried hidden leverage. Assumptions baked into processes that benefited the loudest voice in the room. Power always leaves fingerprints. That realization stayed with me because it mirrored what I had lived through at home. Control rarely announces itself. It embeds, it normalizes, it waits for resistance before it reveals its teeth. The next move came from my grandmother. She called in the early evening, her voice soft, tired, careful in the way people get when they believe they are being reasonable. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Your parents are worried, she said. They don't understand why you're being so hard. I listened without interrupting. They say you've always been sensitive, she continued, that maybe work has changed you. I could picture her sitting at her kitchen table, hands folded, repeating what she had been told. She wasn't the architect of this, she was the messenger. I'm not being hard, I said finally. I'm being clear. She sighed, families forgive. Yes, I said. They also take responsibility. There was a long pause. Then she said something that settled heavily between us. You were always the strong one. I closed my eyes. That sentence had carried so much weight my entire life. Strong meant adaptable. It meant absorbent. It meant no one had to check if I was okay because I always managed. I don't want to be strong anymore, I said quietly. I want to be safe. She didn't reply. We ended the call politely the way people do when they've reached the edge of what they're willing to understand. That night, my attorney emailed again. They had amended the trust anyway. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough to create the appearance of fairness. They're trying to show good faith, she wrote, without admitting wrongdoing. I read the attachment carefully. The language was smoother now, less overt. The conditions softened but not removed. Authority still centralized, control still intact. It was a performance. I forwarded it back with one sentence. Insufficient. The next escalation was subtle but more dangerous. A former colleague of mine reached out on social media. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He asked how I was doing, mentioned he'd heard my name in passing connected to a family business dispute. I asked where he heard it. Your father mentioned it, he said, at a networking thing. He seemed concerned. Concerned. That word again. My father had always known how to frame himself. Calm. Reasonable. The man trying to hold things together while his daughter spiraled. I didn't correct the colleague. I thanked him for checking in and made a note of the interaction. Then I called my attorney. They're testing reputational pressure, she said, seeing if they can isolate you. What do we do? I asked. We make the record louder than the rumors, she replied. That meant filing formal complaints, not dramatic ones, accurate ones, with documentation, with timelines, with facts that did not rely on emotion or interpretation. We submitted them to the relevant institutions, quietly, professionally. Within days, the tone shifted again. My parents' attorney requested a call. My attorney declined and sent a written response instead. The back and forth continued like that for a week. Offers softened. Language changed. Pressure redirected. Then something unexpected happened. Nathan called. Not emailed, not messaged. Called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was different from the others. No accusation, no guilt, just exhaustion. I don't know how this got so out of control, he said. But everything's falling apart. Mom and Dad won't stop. The business is stalled. They keep saying you're doing this to punish us. I deleted the voicemail without replying. Not because I didn't care, because I finally understood something crucial. None of this was out of control. It was functioning exactly as designed. The system worked as long as I complied. The moment I stopped, it revealed itself. Panic wasn't evidence of chaos. It was evidence of dependence. They needed my silence to keep their structure standing. Without it, everything wobbled. The breaking point came a few days later when my attorney called with a change in tone. They've requested emergency mediation, she said. Not voluntary, court ordered. I sat down. That means I asked. That means they're worried, she replied. And they don't have many options left. The mediation date was set quickly. Neutral location, neutral facilitator. No raised voices, no dramatics. I prepared by doing nothing emotional. I slept, I ate, I reviewed documents. On the morning of the mediation, I wore a simple jacket and slacks. Nothing that suggested defensiveness or aggression. I arrived early and sat quietly, hands folded, breathing steady. When my parents walked in, they looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, energetically. My mother avoided my eyes. My father nodded stiffly. Nathan didn't come. That absence told me more than his presence ever could have. The mediator explained the rules. Neutral language, no interruptions, stick to facts. My parents spoke first. They framed their concern as fear, their pressure as misunderstanding, their interference as love misapplied. I listened. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount childhood. I spoke about consent, about authorization, about documentation, about impact. I spoke about what happens when boundaries are ignored repeatedly and deliberately. When I finished, the room was quiet. The mediator asked a few clarifying questions, then turned to my parents. "Do you dispute the facts?" he asked. They didn't answer right away. My father finally spoke. "We just wanted what was best for the family." The mediator nodded. "That's not what I asked." Silence. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not explosive, but definitive. Because in that silence, something irreversible happened. The story they had been telling collapsed under its own weight, and for the first time they had no version of events that didn't expose what they had done. I walked out of that room knowing the end was close. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped carrying what was never mine to begin with. And systems built on borrowed strength do not survive the return of what they took. The mediation did not end with raised voices or slammed doors. It ended the way control usually does when it runs out of leverage, with paperwork. 3 days after the session, my attorney sent me a draft agreement. Not a reconciliation, not an apology, a formal restructuring. The trust would be dissolved. Assets would be redistributed directly. No discretionary clauses, no conditional language, no future leverage, disguised as generosity. My parents would relinquish their role as trustees. An independent administrator would be appointed temporarily, with a defined sunset clause. In exchange, I would withdraw the defamation action and agree to no further civil claims related to past interference provided there were no future violations. It was clean, precise, bloodless. I read the document twice, then a third time more slowly. This was the moment they thought they were giving something up. What they didn't understand was that the money no longer mattered. I asked one question. What happens if they violate this again? My attorney didn't hesitate. Then there are no second chances. I signed. Not because I forgave them, not because I trusted them, but because I understood leverage when I saw it. The agreement was executed the following week. My parents did not call. Nathan did not reach out. The silence that followed felt different than before. Not strategic, not punishing, resigned. At work, the shift was immediate and unexpected. The scrutiny that had hovered quietly in the background lifted. Meetings returned to normal. My supervisor stopped checking in just to make sure. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk and said something that stayed with me. "You handled that well," he said. "Most people don't." "What do most people do?" I asked. "They try to fix relationships that are breaking them," he replied. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and opened my laptop. I pulled up my bank account. The transfer had gone through. The number on the screen was real, substantial, more than I had ever had access to at once. I stared at it without emotion. This money had never been a gift. It had been a chain, and now it was just a tool. The first thing I did was move it. New accounts, separate institutions, layers that required my authorization alone. I paid off what I wanted to pay off. I invested what I wanted to invest. No announcements, no explanations. I did not tell my parents what I did with it. They did not ask. The second thing I did was cut contact. Not dramatically, not publicly. I changed my number. I closed the email account they had always used. I instructed my attorney to route all communication through her office only indefinitely. I did not write a goodbye letter. I had already said everything that needed to be said in rooms where the truth could not be edited. The first real consequence showed up quietly through someone else. An old family friend ran into me at a grocery store. She looked uncomfortable, uncertain whether to speak. She finally did. "Your parents aren't doing well," she said. I nodded. "I'm sorry to hear that." She hesitated. "They say you took everything." I met her eyes calmly. I took what was mine. She didn't argue. That was how I knew the narrative had shifted. Not because people believed me, because they no longer believed them. Over the next few weeks, small things surfaced. Invitations my parents used to receive stopped coming. Nathan's business quietly dissolved. My mother stepped down from a volunteer position she had held for years. No public scandal, no dramatic downfall, just consequences. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance. The real twist, the one I hadn't expected, came from inside myself. I stopped replaying conversations. I stopped rehearsing explanations. I stopped feeling the urge to justify my decisions to people who were no longer in my life. The noise faded. In its place was something unfamiliar. Choice. One evening, while sorting through old documents, I came across a card my mother had written years earlier. A birthday message filled with praise for my reliability, my maturity, my strength. I read it once, then tore it in half and threw it away. Not in anger, in accuracy. Because strength that is only valued when it is convenient is not strength. It is exploitation with better branding. That night I slept deeply, not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time, nothing was reaching for me in the dark, demanding I carry what did not belong to me. The system had collapsed, not with fire, with exposure, and I was already living on the other side of it. The quiet after everything settled was not peaceful at first. It was unfamiliar. Like stepping into a room after a long argument has ended and realizing no one is coming back to finish it. For weeks I moved through my days half expecting interruption, a message slipping through a crack, a call routed the wrong way, a name appearing where it no longer belonged. None did. That absence forced me to confront something I hadn't planned for. Without the pressure, without the constant low-level vigilance, I didn't immediately know what to do with myself. That realization unsettled me more than the conflict ever had. For most of my adult life, I had been oriented around management. Managing expectations, managing emotions, managing outcomes that were never fully in my control. Even my independence had been structured around avoiding dependence, not choosing freedom. Now there was nothing to manage. So I started small. I stopped answering emails after hours. Not dramatically, just quietly. I took full lunch breaks instead of eating at my desk. I booked a week off work and didn't fill it with productivity. The first day of that week, I woke up at my usual time out of habit. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for urgency to kick in. It didn't. I got up, made coffee, and sat by the window watching the street wake up. People walking dogs, a woman loading groceries into her car, a man standing on the curb scrolling through his phone like time didn't exist. Normal life. That afternoon, I drove out of the city with no destination. I took roads I didn't recognize, let myself get slightly lost, then found my way back without panic. That felt symbolic in a way I didn't fully understand yet. The first real emotional aftershock came a few days later. I was standing in line at a pharmacy when the cashier asked casually if I wanted to put a purchase on the family account. The word family hit me harder than I expected. I felt a brief tightening in my chest. Not grief exactly, but awareness. The realization that I no longer belonged to the structure I had spent decades accommodating. "No," I said, "just me." The words felt solid. That night, I dreamed about my childhood home for the first time in months. Not the version filled with tension and negotiation, but the early one, before everything was measured, before praise became conditional. I woke up unsettled, not because I wanted to go back, but because memory has a way of resurfacing when it realizes it's no longer being suppressed. I didn't push it away. I let myself grieve the family I thought I had, not the one that existed. The grief didn't ask me to act. It didn't demand explanation. It passed through quietly, leaving behind something clearer. Acceptance. At work, a new opportunity appeared that would have terrified me a year earlier. A promotion, more visibility, more authority, more scrutiny. My supervisor framed it carefully, watching my reaction. "We think you're ready," he said. "But it's your call. No pressure, no manipulation, no assumption." I asked for time to think. That alone felt like progress. When I said yes a few days later, it wasn't because I wanted validation. It was because the role aligned with who I was becoming, not who I had been trained to be. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Around that time, a distant cousin reached out. Not with accusation, not with guilt, with curiosity. "I heard things changed," she wrote. "I don't know what's true, but I hope you're okay." I read the message slowly. Then I replied honestly, "I am. I chose distance." She didn't respond right away. When she did, it was brief. "That makes sense." That was it. No argument, no persuasion, no attempt to pull me back in. I realized then that the people worth keeping didn't require explanation. They recognized boundaries without needing to be taught what they were. The others faded naturally. I stopped hearing updates, stopped receiving indirect messages, stopped being the subject of whispered concern. Silence, it turned out, was not something to fear once it was no longer enforced. It was something to use. One evening, while sorting through paperwork, I found a copy of the agreement we had signed. The signatures, the dates, the language that had finally ended a dynamic that once felt immovable. I read it again, not with relief, but with perspective. This was the point of no return. Not because of the money, because of the clarity. I could never unknow what I now understood about control disguised as care, about generosity used as leverage, about how easily love can become transactional when power goes unchallenged. That knowledge changed the way I looked at everything. At friendships, at professional relationships, at myself. I became more selective, not colder, just more precise. I stopped volunteering for emotional labor no one had earned. I stopped explaining decisions that didn't affect anyone else. I stopped confusing availability with kindness. People adjusted, or they didn't. Either way, I no longer felt responsible. The final test came unexpectedly. I received a handwritten letter forwarded through my attorney's office from my mother. Not an apology, not an accusation. An update. She wrote about her health, about feeling lost, about how things weren't the same anymore. She didn't ask me to come back. She didn't acknowledge what she had done. She simply wrote as if the past were a misunderstanding that time might soften. I held the letter in my hands for a long moment. Then I placed it back in the envelope and filed it away. Not out of cruelty, out of truth. Understanding does not require access. Compassion does not require surrender. I could acknowledge her humanity without reopening the door to a system that had nearly erased mine. That night, I stood by the window again, looking out at the same street, now familiar in a different way. I wasn't waiting for anything. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not revenge. What I had gained wasn't dramatic. It was steadiness. And I understood then that the most profound consequence of choosing yourself is not what happens to the people who tried to control you. It's what happens when you finally stop orbiting them. The center shifts. And once it does, everything else rearranges around it, without asking, without warning, without needing permission. The invitation arrived without warning, folded neatly inside an envelope that had been forwarded through my attorney's office. No return address, no note. Just a single card with a date, a time, and a location. My parents' house. A Sunday afternoon. No explanation. I didn't need one. They were trying to reclaim ground, not emotionally, symbolically. After distance settles in, people who are used to control often reach for ritual. Birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, anything that allows them to pretend nothing fundamental has changed. I didn't respond. 2 days later, my attorney called. "They're requesting acknowledgement," she said. "Not attendance, just confirmation that you received it." I almost laughed. "They want proof I'm still reachable," I said. "Yes," she replied. "Do you want me to respond?" "No," I said. "Let silence answer." That week, I was promoted officially. The announcement went out internally, brief and professional. No fanfare, just a new title and a longer list of responsibilities. The congratulations came steadily. Colleagues stopped by my desk. A few sent emails. One woman I barely knew leaned in and said, "You've always had leadership energy. It just wasn't loud." I smiled politely, but her words stayed with me. Not loud. That had always been the accusation at home. That my way of existing wasn't performative enough to deserve respect. Now, in a space built on outcomes instead of appearances, it was being recognized for exactly what it was. Competence. That contrast sharpened something in me. I stopped minimizing my accomplishments in conversation. I stopped deflecting praise. I stopped translating my success into something smaller so others wouldn't feel threatened. Nothing bad happened. The people who respected me leaned in. The ones who preferred me quieter adjusted their distance. That pattern repeated everywhere. The real twist arrived near the end of the month. My attorney forwarded a document without commentary, just an attachment and a single line. "You should see this." It was a petition, filed quietly. My parents were attempting to amend the trust settlement after the fact, citing emotional distress and undue influence. They weren't challenging the dissolution directly. They were trying to reopen the narrative, trying to reframe my boundaries as instability. I read the document slowly. It was carefully worded, vague, heavy on feeling light on fact. A last attempt to reassert control through implication rather than authority. I closed the file and sat back in my chair. For the first time since all of this began, I felt something close to anger. Not explosive. Focused. I called my attorney. "They're escalating," I said. "Yes," she replied. "But they're doing it poorly." "What do you recommend?" I asked. She paused. "We counter. Not with another letter. With evidence." We submitted the full timeline. Every unauthorized inquiry, every attempt to contact my employer, every misrepresentation, every document they had denied knowing about. We didn't argue intent. We showed pattern. The response was swift. The petition was withdrawn within the week. No explanation, no apology, just silence. That was the moment I understood something critical. They weren't fighting because they believed they were right. They were fighting because they were losing relevance. Once the system no longer revolved around them, they didn't know where to stand. I expected that realization to bring satisfaction. It didn't. What it brought was finality. I spent the following weekend clearing out my apartment. Not moving, just simplifying. Old clothes, old files, objects I had kept out of habit rather than attachment. I found a box of family photos I hadn't looked at in years. I went through them carefully, my parents smiling at events I barely remembered. Nathan front and center in every frame. Me off to the side holding something watching someone else. I didn't feel resentment. I felt confirmation. I kept one photo, threw the rest away. The one I kept wasn't flattering, it wasn't symbolic, it was honest. Me alone at a table reading. That had always been my truest self. On Monday morning, I sent one final instruction to my attorney. No more forwarding unless legally required. She acknowledged it without question. The door was closed. Not slammed. Closed. At work, I was asked to speak at a small internal meeting about process improvement. I prepared carefully. Not because I was nervous, but because I cared. When I stood at the front of the room and spoke, I didn't think about how I sounded. I thought about accuracy. The room listened. Afterward, one of the senior leaders pulled me aside. "You don't waste words," he said. "That's rare." I thanked him and went back to my desk. That evening, I went home and sat in the quiet with a sense of completion I hadn't known how to name before. The conflict hadn't ended because everyone agreed. It had ended because I stopped participating. That distinction mattered. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their understanding. I didn't even need their silence. I needed my autonomy. And I had it. The invitation card remained unanswered. Eventually, it stopped mattering. And that was how I knew this chapter of my life was truly over. Not because the noise stopped, but because I no longer heard it. The weeks after the petition was withdrawn felt strangely weightless. Not happy, not sad, just unburdened. When you've lived for years under a constant low-grade pressure, the absence of it doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like disorientation, like your body is waiting for instructions that never arrive. I noticed it in small ways. I would finish a workday and not feel the urge to check my phone immediately. I would sit in silence without filling it. I would make plans without calculating how they might be received or interpreted by someone else. There was no audience anymore. That realization took time to settle. One evening, I was invited to a colleague's birthday dinner. Nothing formal, a long table at a neighborhood restaurant, laughter that rose and fell naturally, conversations that overlapped without competition. At one point, someone asked about my family, not prying, just casual. I answered simply, "We're not close." No explanation followed. No one pressed. The conversation moved on. I sat there quietly stunned by how easy that was, how little space the truth actually took when it wasn't being defended. Later that night, walking home under streetlights that hummed faintly above me, I understood something that had never been modeled in my family. Healthy people don't demand access. They accept information at face value and move accordingly. That understanding softened something in me, not toward my parents, toward myself. At work, the new role stretched me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Decisions carried weight now, not symbolic weight, actual consequences. I was trusted with budgets, timelines, people's work, and I noticed something important. I wasn't afraid. I had been managing complexity my entire life. I had just never been allowed to call it leadership. Now, without emotional sabotage running in the background, the work felt almost clean. One afternoon, after a long meeting, I sat alone in my office and caught my reflection in the glass. I looked different, not physically, energetically. Straighter, quieter, less apologetic. I thought about how many times I had been told that distance was cruelty, that boundaries were punishment, that self-protection meant I lacked empathy. None of that held up under scrutiny. Empathy that requires self-destruction is not empathy. It's coercion. That realization changed how I viewed the apologies that never quite came. My parents never said they were wrong. They said they were hurt. They said they were confused. They said I had misunderstood their intentions. What they never said was that they had crossed lines deliberately, repeatedly, and without consent. I stopped expecting that acknowledgement, not because I didn't deserve it, because I no longer needed it to move forward. The final attempt at contact came quietly. A holiday card. No return address. Just a generic message inside. Wishing me well. Hoping for peace. Signed with first names only as if familiarity might slip past the boundary they could no longer cross directly. I stared at the card for a long moment. Then I recycled it. Not out of spite, out of completion. That winter, I traveled alone for the first time in years. No family obligations. No explanations required. I went somewhere cold and quiet where the days were short and the nights long. I walked, I read, I thought. I realized how much of my identity had been shaped in reaction to others. Even my independence had been defined by what I was escaping, not what I was choosing. That trip helped recalibrate something essential. I wasn't running anymore. I was building. When I returned home, I started therapy. Not because I was broken, because I wanted to understand myself without the distortion of someone else's expectations. In those sessions, patterns emerged. The early responsibility, the praise for being easy, the way love was tied to usefulness. None of it surprised me. What surprised me was how quickly my nervous system responded to consistent safety. Sleep improved, focus sharpened. My body stopped bracing for impact. The absence of chaos created space. Space for curiosity, space for desire, space for questions that had nothing to do with survival. What do I actually want? That question had never been safe to ask before. Now it was unavoidable. I didn't answer it all at once. I answered it in pieces, by saying no when I meant no, by saying yes without justification, by choosing rest over explanation. The further I moved into this new shape of living, the clearer something became. My family's power over me had never come from authority. It came from my belief that I needed their approval to exist peacefully. Once that belief dissolved, everything else followed naturally. They were not villains. They were not monsters. They were people who had confused control with care and doubled down when challenged. That didn't make them evil. It made them unsafe. And unsafe people do not get access no matter how familiar they feel. As the year turned, I felt a sense of alignment that had nothing to do with triumph. I hadn't won. I had withdrawn. And that withdrawal had allowed me to step into a life that no longer required constant negotiation. I didn't know yet what the next chapter would look like. But for the first time, I trusted myself to write it without asking permission. That trust felt like the real inheritance. Everything else had just been paperwork. The year ended without ceremony. No final confrontation. No last message that changed everything. No dramatic moment where the past knocked one more time and I answered differently. It simply ended the way unhealthy systems often do when you stop feeding them. Quietly, uneventfully, permanently. On the last morning of the year, I woke before my alarm and lay still listening to the city breathe. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck idled. A neighbor closed a door. Life continued in small, ordinary motions. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt present. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching condensation gather and slide down the glass. For a long time, mornings like this used to trigger a familiar mental inventory. Who needed something? What I owed? What I should prepare for emotionally before the day could begin. That inventory was gone. In its place was space. Not emptiness, space. Later that day, I went for a walk without headphones. No music, no podcast, just my own footsteps and the sound of the city moving around me. I passed families carrying bags, couples arguing softly, people rushing nowhere urgent. I noticed how little of it reached inside me. I had always believed distance would feel like loss. Instead, it felt like orientation. I stopped at a bookstore and wandered without intention. I picked up a journal with a plain cover and bought it without thinking. When I got home, I opened it and wrote a single line on the first page. I am no longer available for roles that require my silence. That sentence didn't feel defiant. It felt factual. In the weeks that followed, my life continued to take shape around that truth. Not dramatically, not loudly, but consistently. I said no more often. I explained less. I trusted my instincts even when they led me away from familiarity. People responded accordingly. Some leaned in with respect. Some drifted away without explanation. Some tried once more to test old dynamics and found nothing to push against. I didn't take it personally. Boundaries aren't walls meant to punish. They're filters that clarify. The final update about my family came indirectly months later. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that my parents had moved. Smaller place, quieter life, less visibility. Nathan had taken a job out of state, nothing remarkable, just work. The story they had built no longer had an audience. I felt no urge to check in, no satisfaction, no guilt. Just distance doing what distance does best. Time passed. My work deepened. My confidence stabilized into something that didn't fluctuate based on feedback. I stopped performing competence and started inhabiting it. One afternoon during a meeting, someone challenged a decision I made. Not aggressively, just directly. I listened, considered, disagreed. No apology, no defensiveness. The room moved on. Later, someone pulled me aside and said, "You don't disappear when challenged." I smiled. "I used to," I said. "I just don't anymore." That moment stayed with me because it captured the quiet transformation better than any milestone ever could. I had stopped vanishing, not just from my family, from myself. The truth is, I didn't get revenge in the way stories usually describe it. I didn't expose secrets publicly. I didn't watch anyone fall in flames. What I did was withdraw consent. Consent to be used. Consent to be rewritten. Consent to carry weight that was never mine. And when you withdraw consent from a system built on entitlement, the system doesn't collapse dramatically. It starves, slowly, inevitably. That is the kind of revenge that leaves no mess to clean up afterward. Only space. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself in it, I want you to hear something clearly. You don't owe anyone access to your life just because they raised you, funded you, helped you once, or share your blood. You don't owe endless understanding to people who never paused to understand you. And you don't need to make your boundaries palatable to the people who benefit from you having none. Choosing yourself does not require cruelty. It requires clarity. Integrity is not loud. Dignity is not reactive. And self-respect is not something you negotiate. It's something you decide. The moment I stopped trying to be a good daughter in a system that punished autonomy, I became a whole person in my own life. That was the real reversal of power. Not because they lost something, but because I stopped losing myself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been excluded, controlled, or quietly erased by people who claim to love you, you're not alone. Tell me in the comments what choosing yourself looked like for you, or what boundary you're still learning how to hold. And if you want more stories like this, stories about family drama, betrayal, karma, and the moment the tables turn without shouting, stay here. Some victories don't make noise. They make peace. And once you feel it, you never give it back.